Hey everybody, this is Michelle Brown coming to you today, and since it's Valentine's Day, I thought I would do the housing allowance video because that's a way our churches can show some love to our pastors, okay? So let's get into housing allowance. Housing allowance is tends to be, for some reason, one of the most confusing aspects of a minister's compensation package. That's the thing that I get the most questions on. That's the thing that is usually done most incorrectly, not only at the church level, but also in tax preparation. So we want to make sure that we cover this. And again, I will do my best to have this done in less than 30 minutes. So let's get started. So first of all, what's the big deal about the housing allowance? Okay, the housing allowance is free of income tax, federal income tax, up to an allowable amount, but it's still subject to self-employment tax. So think of minister compensation as a circle, okay? And we're going to divide it into thirds. This third of it is your fringe benefits package, okay? That's the best part of the compensation package because it's generally tax-free benefits, okay? The bottom third of your circle is housing allowance because it's only subject to self-employment tax. And then this third of the circle over here is your salary, which is subject to federal income tax and self-employment taxes, okay? So housing allowance is this bottom third down here. So we want to make sure that we are offering our ministers housing allowance, because really if your church is not offering your minister a housing allowance, they are really doing him a disservice, because that's the biggest tax benefit of the dual tax status of being a qualified minister, is to receive that housing allowance that is not subject to federal income taxes, okay? So you heard me say the word qualified minister. So there are a few must-dos before you can legitimately offer a housing allowance to a minister. The first one is that they must possess a qualifying ministerial credential from a church. And they must also be performing ministerial duties, okay? So the IRS has a two-step process, and the ministers have to meet both of these. Number one is they have to be credentialed, which means they need to be duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed by a legitimate 501c3 organization, okay? And number two, they must be performing ministerial duties. All right, and we'll go over what those are. I think we did that in the last video, okay? So you can't be either one or two and get the housing allowance. You have to qualify for both, okay? You have to be credentialed and you have to be performing ministerial duties, which means that I like to give the example, if you have a minister who is a licensed minister, okay, was served in the church as a senior pastor for 25 years. He retires, decides he needs the extra money, goes to work for another church as a janitor, okay? Even though he's still a licensed, credentialed minister, he is not performing ministerial duties as a janitor at that church, so his income cannot be designated as housing allowance. He gets just regular W-2 employee wages, okay? So the big deal is, and a lot of churches get in trouble with this, the housing allowance has to be designated in advance before the very first payment is made to the minister, okay? So churches providing housing allowance should determine and designate the amount of the housing allowance by an official action of the church, okay? So that means it needs to be written down and approved either in the business meeting minutes. It needs to be in an employment contract is also a great way to put it, detailing that the amount that's going to be provided, and also in an approved budget, which details the amounts that are allocated to each minister, okay? If you want to get nerdy and you want to look up the Internal Revenue Code section that deals with this, it's section 107. Okay, and also if you want to look at a tax court memo, it's a LOGIE, L-O-G-I-E versus the Commissioner Tax Court Memo 1998-387, because I like numbers. Okay, so reporting the housing allowance should not be reported as part of the minister's gross wages. Okay, so on the W-2, box 1 on the W-2 is the salary that the minister makes. Housing allowance is not included in box 1 wages. You put that down in box 14 and you label it housing allowance, okay? There is another option. If you don't, and you'd be amazed how much feedback I get sometimes from churches that don't want to put that box 14 housing for whatever reason. If you just don't want to do that, or if you've got a church client that does not want to do that, you can put the housing designation on official church letterhead and give that to your minister, and he can use that for his tax documents. But it needs to be in writing, either in box 14 of his W-2 or on a church letterhead designating how much of his salary and wages was housing allowance, okay? So the consequences of not designating this properly, okay, can actually mean that zero amount of the pastor's housing allowance can actually legally be designated as an allowable housing allowance, and we do not want that to happen, okay? Designation of the housing allowance should be done on an annual basis, because you actually should be working with your senior pastors or your qualified ministers who are receiving housing allowance to see if any adjustments need to be made. But kind of a safety net that you can do is, when you approve the original housing allowance and the ministerial compensation package in your minutes and in your contract, you can put a little blurb in there that says the housing allowance for 2019 and all future years, unless otherwise provided, is XYZ, okay? And that way, if everything stays the same, if you and your staff agree that nothing needs to change, you don't have to go through this process every year. It's covered by having that blurb in your meeting minutes. But, you know, generally, housing costs go up. I definitely know house insurance goes up. Sometimes property taxes go up. If your escrow amount gets too low, then they can tack on extra prices on your housing. So it's always the best bet to reevaluate the housing cost every year. But if not, you can put that blurb in there, okay? So what expenses qualify for housing allowances, okay? Number one, this is for your primary residence only. If your minister has a house in their town, but they have especially if you have a new minister that just moved in from another state, the house that they had in the other state hasn't sold yet, so they're paying cost on both houses. No, they can no longer claim the expenses of the house back in Virginia, if that's where they moved from, okay? Only their primary residence is excludable. So they need to come up with cost for repairs and maintenance, okay? Which is plumbing, electrical repairs, light bulbs, brooms, cleaning supplies can be included in that, okay? The cost of utilities, heat, electric, water, sewer, trash, cable, internet, a landline, okay? You are not allowed to deduct cell phone cost in housing allowance. It's got to be a landline. Furnishings. If you have to replace your dishwasher or your refrigerator or your hot water heater, drapes or curtains or, rugs for your house, you can include those costs in your actual housing cost. Lawn care, if you got to buy a lawnmower, if you pay someone to come and mow your yard during the summer, do these things, okay? You've got to seed your yard, whatever it costs that is reasonable for lawn care, you can include that in there, okay? If you're paying $200 a month for somebody to come mow your yard, you're not paying $200 a month 12 months a year, okay? So figure maybe depending on what part of the country you're in, what months of the year do you actually have mowing going on. Those are legitimate, can be included in the housing allowance cost. And then obviously homeowners insurance, mortgage payments, rent, real estate taxes, home equity lines. Home equity lines can only be included in your housing allowance cost if the portion of your home equity line was actually used for repairs for your home or construction on your home, or if you built a new deck. It's got to be related to your housing, okay? Then you can include the interest on that, okay? So that's several things And you need to do this. You need to have your housing cost, okay? Because if a church designates $20,000 for a housing allowance, okay, the individual, the minister, does not automatically get to deduct $20,000 as a housing allowance. Okay, that's not the way it works. For housing allowance, you are allowed to include the least of the three. Just remember that, least of the three. Number one is the actual amount designated by the church. Number two are the actual housing cost, which is why it's so important for you to keep track of your housing costs during the year. And number three, which a lot of ministers don't like this one, and they're like, I never had to do this before, is the fair rental value plus utilities plus furnishings for your home, okay? So if you get audited and you don't have something in your tax file for fair rental value of your home, the IRS is going to go to Zillow and they're going to pull up and they're going to use whatever number Zillow gives them, okay? You don't want to leave that to chance because housing values change, okay, in your location. And we want to make sure that for the year that you've got, that it's the best, okay? So if you've got a really great real estate market going, your housing values are going to be higher, your rental values are going to be higher. The economy crashes, you get audited 2 years later. The IRS goes to Zillow 2 years later because housing values have gone down, your rental values gone down. They're going to use that lower number, which may cause you to be disallowed some of your housing allowance, and we don't want that to happen, okay? So again, qualified housing allowance exemptions are the lesser of the actual cost that you have, okay? The allowance designated in advance by the church, okay? Or the fair rental value plus utilities plus furnishings. This is for ministers who own their own home or rent where they're living as well, okay? So it goes for home ownership and for rental. Whew. Okay, did a training on Monday night. One of the questions was, had a minister who's been working for this church for about 4 years. He's not been receiving housing allowance because he was bivocational. That has nothing to do with it, okay? Most ministers in the United States are bivocational. That is okay. They still fully qualify for the housing allowance, okay? So again, if churches are not offering their qualified ministers housing allowance as part of their salary package, they are doing them a disservice, okay? So, a couple things we want to make sure. Let's see, we want to make sure that the rental value should be reevaluated every 3 to 5 years. And the minister should obtain proof of the rental value in writing as part of your tax records, okay? You can actually go to have a local realtor that has rental companies and just have them come out. You don't have to have a formal appraisal. Just have them come out and say, okay, if we were to rent our home fully furnished, what is the going rate for it? Have them write it down on a piece of paper, stick it with your tax files, you're good to go, okay? So that's the deal, okay? Qualified ministers, either duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed, plus have to be exercising ministerial duties, okay, in order to qualify. And then also, I have this question a lot, is what percentage of our compensation can we designate as housing allowance? There is no percentage in the Internal Revenue Code. It's just got to be reasonable, okay? Because again, you're only going to get to deduct the allowable allowance there, which is again the least of the actual expenses, the designated amount, or the fair rental value, plus utilities, plus furnishings, okay? So it's not going to do you any good if you're getting a $40,000 a year compensation package and you're like, I want it all designated as housing allowance. If when you actually go through the calculations, your actual expenses are only $25,000, because that difference between the 40 that's designated and the 25 that's actually allowed, that $15,000, you're going to pay federal income taxes on it anyways. So it's a no-brainer. You did not do any advantage whatsoever trying to do that. Okay, so If you got any questions about housing allowance, it really is not as complicated as it tends to be. And maybe it's just because I study it so much, but it's just a simple matter of when doing tax preparation, there are 3 or 4 clergy worksheets that you fill out, and then keeping good tax records, okay? So that's housing allowance. So show your pastor some love. Give them the tax benefit of a housing allowance. Again, it doesn't matter if they're full-time or part-time, if they're bivocational, if they make 60 grand a year, or if they only get 5 grand a year. You need to be doing that, especially with the new, again, I'm going to keep bringing this up till everybody understands it, the new TCJA laws. The pastors have lost some of their reimbursable tax expenses due to unreimbursed business expenses. Okay, so you need to have housing allowance for your ministers, and you need to have the accountable reimbursement plan. So if you got any questions, please post them below. We do have, I think, one more section to do in this series, and then we will move on to the next one. So I hope y'all have a great Valentine's Day, and I'll see you again soon.